Hi there. I'm just a little cat trying to reach my first 1,000 subscribers. It's free. Just click subscribe right under this video. It would mean the world to me.
When I saw the photo of my brother sipping champagne in first class, reclining like royalty in one of those pods that lie completely flat, with a warm towel in one hand and a smug grin stretched across his face, I was sitting on a cracked plastic chair in a laundromat, waiting on my dryer cycle to finish because I didn't have enough socks to make it through the week. That photo was posted just 2 hours after I got a text from my mother, casually worded, with a smiling emoji at the end. Wish we could have taken you too, Jess, but the budget was just too tight this time. No punctuation, no apology, no sense of hesitation, just a text that read more like a grocery list than a message to a daughter. I sat there staring at the screen for what felt like a full hour, the drone of the dryers humming behind me like some low-budget horror soundtrack, while I tried to reconcile how they always managed to make me feel like an afterthought, even after nearly 4 decades of living in their shadow. My brother Greg looked relaxed, like he hadn't lifted a finger in years, which was accurate, to be fair. His suit jacket was crisp, his seat came with real silverware, and my parents were seated right behind him, grinning like they'd won a contest. I didn't even know they'd booked a trip to Europe until a few days before they left, and even then, the details were fuzzy. "It's just a little getaway," Mom had said. "We figured we'd take Greg for his birthday. He's had such a stressful year, poor thing." That stressful year she was referring to. Greg's third startup had tanked after barely lasting 6 months, which meant my parents had spent the better part of the year cushioning him with rent money, legal help, and another loan they wouldn't call a loan. But when I needed a new water heater last winter, they sent me a video link to DIY home repairs. That was my role, the independent one, the reliable one, the one who never really asks for much, as Mom liked to tell her friends when they complimented her parenting. I was 36, single, a public school teacher, living in a rental I could barely afford, eating pasta 3 nights a week, and calling it variety, while Greg had somehow turned every failure into a red carpet rolled out by our parents. The worst part wasn't the money. It never really was. It was the message underneath it. The silent scream that said, "You don't matter as much." I could take being broke. What broke me was realizing that I'd been emotionally bankrupt in their eyes for years and just hadn't noticed it because I kept excusing it away. I had learned to water myself down, to shrink in the presence of their praise for Greg, to stop expecting birthday calls or congratulations for promotions. Every milestone of mine was labeled cute, while his smallest achievements were incredible, and I accepted it. I let it slide because I didn't want to be the difficult one. But something about that photo, Greg, with his foot on a literal footrest, holding champagne like it belonged to him, sent something cold and sharp through my chest. I stared at that image until the colors blurred, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something very close to hatred. Not the loud, fiery kind, but the quiet, clean-cut kind that makes you see things for what they really are. I wasn't mad they didn't take me to Europe. I was done pretending that this family had ever been a place where I was wanted. That night, I opened the family group chat, aptly titled The Coopers, and scrolled through months of conversation. Every thread was a monument to Greg's life. Greg's new car, Greg's birthday dinner, Greg's dog's Halloween costume. My name showed up only when I initiated, and even then, the replies were short, dry, dismissive. I didn't say anything. I didn't type out some angry paragraph or drop a passive-aggressive meme. I just hit leave group and let the silence answer for me. Later, while lying on my too-soft mattress under the hum of a ceiling fan I still hadn't gotten around to fixing, I thought about all the times I'd made excuses for them. I remembered my 16th birthday party, when they forgot to bring the cake, and told me with a laugh that I didn't really care about that stuff anyway. I remembered my college graduation, when they left halfway through to beat traffic. I remembered the Thanksgiving I spent alone after Greg got COVID, and they decided to cancel dinner entirely just to be safe, even though I lived 2 blocks away and tested negative twice. All those moments were bricks, and now I had a full wall built around me. It was the first time I admitted to myself, not out of anger, but out of clarity, that I was not part of a family. I was part of a Greg support system, disguised as a family. And for the first time, I felt the terrifying freedom of that realization. Tell me this. Have you ever reached a point where the people who were supposed to love you the most became the ones you had to emotionally survive? When the weight of being the good one, the reliable one, the one who understands, finally crushed your chest until you couldn't breathe anymore? Because that's where I was. And I was done pretending that my silence meant peace. It didn't. It meant I was holding in a scream so loud, it would have shattered the walls if I let it out. That night, I decided something, not in some dramatic cinematic way, but like a switch being flipped. Quiet, final. I wasn't going to fight anymore. I wasn't going to argue or confront or beg for better treatment. No, I was going to do what they least expected. I was going to disappear. And I wasn't going to leave a trail. Because sometimes the best way to show people what they've lost is to remove yourself so completely that they start to wonder if you were ever real in the first place. I don't know if there's a specific moment in a person's life when they realize they've been relegated to the background, or if it happens in layers, thin, barely noticeable slights and emotional bruises that build up slowly until one day you look at the entire structure and realize it's a monument to being ignored. For me, it wasn't the champagne in Greg's glass or the smooth recline of his plane seat that finally cracked the dam. It was what happened the next morning, when my mother left me a voicemail that started with her usual sing-song tone and ended with a sentence that would play in my head like an echo inside a hollow room. I know you're probably busy, Jess, but you've always been our responsible one, right? I listened to it while brushing my teeth, standing in front of the mirror, toothbrush still foaming in my mouth, as my mother's words floated through the tiny speaker like a command dressed up in affection. You've always been our responsible one. And just like that, I understood exactly how they saw me. Not as someone with her own needs, desires, or exhaustion, but as a permanent safety net. Someone who didn't require emotional nourishment because I'd been labeled stable before I was even old enough to know what that meant. Being the responsible one was code for, you don't get to complain. It was the grown-up version of being the kid who gets told to understand because your brother's having a tough time right now. And it came with invisible handcuffs that no one else seemed to notice. That night, I sat on my small couch, one leg tucked under me, laptop on the coffee table, a half-empty glass of wine in my hand, and opened a new document titled simply, Plan. I wasn't exactly sure what the end goal was yet. I didn't know if I was going to move across the country, disappear for a few months, or just cut ties quietly and let the silence do the work. What I did know is that I wasn't going to keep living like this. I was 36 years old, with a master's degree, a solid job, and a good credit score, and somehow I still felt like the unpaid intern in my own family, working overtime for no recognition, while Greg walked around with a parade float behind him for waking up in the morning. Part of me felt childish, even writing it out. Who runs away from their family at almost 40? But the other part, the part that had learned to put herself last for decades, was finally starting to get loud enough to drown out the shame. I called my best friend Lauren, who's known me since freshman year of college, and told her everything. She listened, like she always does, and when I finished, there was a long pause before she said the one thing that stuck with me more than anything else that week. You ever thought about what it would look like if you just didn't come back? At first I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it felt like such a foreign idea. Leaving wasn't something I'd ever considered real. I had daydreamed about it, sure, fantasized about starting over in a small town where no one knew my name or my brother's LinkedIn resume, but it always felt like something that belonged in someone else's life, not mine. I was the anchor, remember? The one who never left. The daughter who kept the group chat alive with polite responses and birthday reminders. But that night, after hanging up the phone, I stared at my ceiling in the dark and thought, what if I really did? Over the next few days, the plan began to take shape. I didn't announce anything. I didn't post vague statuses on social media or drop hints in the group chat. I just started preparing. I cleared out my closet. I sold the dresser on Facebook Marketplace. I called my landlord and gave notice under the pretense of moving closer to work. I gathered every childhood photo of myself I could find, the few that weren't cropped or blurred or buried behind Greg's face, and boxed them up. And with each step, something in my chest started to loosen, like a belt that had been cinched too tight for too long. I wasn't angry anymore, not in the way I'd been in the laundromat. This wasn't about revenge, not yet. It was about self-preservation, about reclaiming the parts of myself I'd handed over like receipts for affection I never received. Of course, there were moments of doubt, moments where I'd stare at a box of books and think, is this really what you're doing? But then I'd remember the way my mother said budget's tight with the same tone she used when asking someone to pass the butter. I'd remember how my father, when I called to say happy birthday last year, barely paused his football game to thank me. And I'd remember the time I broke my wrist shoveling snow alone while Greg had 3 people helping him pack for a business trip. Every memory was a nail, and I was finally ready to build my own escape hatch. By Thursday evening, I had booked a moving truck for the Sunday they were scheduled to return from their trip. A one-way rental. No forwarding address, no dramatic confrontation, just a clean, quiet exit. The kind of thing people only notice when it's too late to do anything about it. I didn't know where I was going yet. That part would come later. What mattered was that I was going. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like the responsible one. I felt like the free one. And honestly, that felt a hell of a lot better. The day they were flying back from Rome, probably still drunk on Tuscan wine, and the illusion that their family existed in a perfect balance where no one ever got hurt or left behind. I stood barefoot in the middle of my living room, surrounded by 30 boxes stacked in careful rows like a tiny army preparing to vanish without a sound. There was a strange kind of serenity in that silence, the kind that follows the chaos of decision-making and comes right before the storm of consequence. And as the light from the blinds cut soft patterns across the carpet, I realized that I hadn't cried once throughout the entire week. Not when I canceled my utilities, not when I sold my mother's old vase she'd passed off to me during her spring cleaning spree, and not even when I folded the one family photo where I wasn't standing off to the side like a reluctant extra. That particular silence, the one I found in the emptying of drawers and the wiping of baseboards, was not the kind born of indifference or numbness, but of resolution, that rare kind of clarity that washes over you when you stop waiting for people to change and start accepting that they never will. I had taken 3 days off work, using up the last of my personal days under the pretense of a family matter, which wasn't a lie, even if it wasn't the kind of family matter HR usually imagines when you say those words. I packed slowly, methodically, as if the weight of my past could be sorted and labeled with the right amount of bubble wrap and patience. There were things I chose to leave behind, not because they were meaningless, but because they belonged to a version of me that I no longer recognized. The version who always said yes, always smiled, always showed up with a casserole when no one ever came to her birthday dinner. The framed college diploma with my mother's handwriting on the back that read, "So proud of you, love Mom and Dad," even though I distinctly remembered them skipping the ceremony because Greg's car had a dead battery. The ceramic jewelry box from my 15th birthday, chipped in the corner, that Mom said she found at a yard sale, but insisted looked vintage. And the stack of holiday cards from over the years, all of them signed Love the Coopers, with Greg's name always mentioned first, as if even in something so generic as a printed card, the hierarchy had to be maintained. In the fridge, I left only one thing, a single Post-it note stuck to the inside of the door, written in black ink with the kind of penmanship I'd used for student report cards. It read simply, "Hope it was worth it." I didn't sign it. I didn't need to. The message wasn't meant to explain. It was meant to echo, to reverberate through the kitchen and crawl into their heads like the uncomfortable silence that follows a question no one wants to answer. Just before closing the final box, I placed one printed photo on top. It was the Instagram shot of Greg in first class, his sunglasses tucked into the collar of his Henley, holding a flute of champagne with that same expression he'd worn his entire life, entitled, Amused, Untouched. I printed it in color, not to be petty, but to be clear, to leave behind a memory that couldn't be reworded or misunderstood, or softened by selective retelling. It was, in every way, the visual punchline to a lifetime of one-sided effort. When the movers arrived, they didn't ask questions. I had hired a two-man crew off an app, both in their 20s, both too focused on the logistics of navigating narrow door frames to care why a woman with tired eyes and a steady voice was loading up her life in silence. As they carried box after box into the truck, I stood by with a clipboard, checking items off like it was any other Saturday. But inside, with each slam of the truck's door, each step down the porch, I felt pieces of myself begin to loosen, grief unspooling in quiet threads, not from what I was leaving, but from how long I'd stayed. Before I left, I walked through the house one last time, touching walls like they might speak to me, looking for some kind of validation that I wasn't just acting out some melodrama in my head. I paused in the hallway where Mom used to hang the family growth chart, a pencil-marked line of years and inches that stopped abruptly after Greg's senior year of high school. My name was there, lower down, half erased. It felt symbolic in a way that would have made me roll my eyes if I hadn't been too exhausted to find it funny. I touched the wall once, then turned and walked out. The key, the spare one they gave me years ago with a plastic label that read Jess's, I left on the kitchen counter next to the fruit bowl. I didn't leave a letter, didn't record some final message or create a treasure map of memories. I didn't need to. If they cared enough to notice, the silence would say everything they'd spent years avoiding, and if they didn't, well, then it would only prove I'd made the right choice by leaving. As the truck pulled away, I didn't look back. Not because I wanted to be dramatic or cold, but because the truth is, when you've been invisible long enough, there's nothing left to see anyway. The home they thought I belonged to hadn't felt like mine in years, and now, stripped bare and echoing with absence, it looked exactly how I'd always felt in that family, clean, quiet, and completely empty. I didn't know where the road ahead would take me, not really. I had a few destinations in mind, maybe a cabin rental up north or a small apartment in a city where no one asked questions. But the details didn't matter. What mattered was that I wasn't there anymore, that I had done something that couldn't be undone. And for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I needed to be, not waiting, not hoping, not begging, just gone. They landed sometime just after noon, based on the timestamps of their photos. Greg's smirking face in front of the Trevi fountain, followed by one last image of my parents at the airport arrivals, both of them waving into the camera like two retirees from a travel brochure, sunburnt and oblivious, seemingly unaware that the version of home they were flying back to was no longer the one they thought they'd left behind 2 weeks earlier. It took exactly 13 minutes after their plane touched down for my mother to send the first message in the family group chat, which I never received, because by that time, I had already permanently left it, and my number was quietly making its way into a prepaid SIM card, registered under a different name, tucked into the back of a phone that no longer held any of their photos, numbers, or conversations. According to what I later heard through a mutual friend, because small towns love a whisper, especially when something looks off, but no one wants to admit it yet. My parents walked into the house expecting the usual. The comforting smell of laundry detergent Jessie always used. The faint scent of candles from the dollar store I picked out because Mom once said lavender calmed her. And that subtle, reliable hum of life that only I ever maintained. But what they got instead was a house stripped of memory, a place too clean to feel lived in, every personal object gone without a trace, and every room echoing just a little too much for comfort. The first sign that something was wrong wasn't the empty living room or the bare walls, but the thermostat. Off completely, because no matter what else was happening, I had never let the house get cold, not even when I lived paycheck to paycheck. That little hum of warm air was always my way of keeping the home alive, even when I wasn't sure why I bothered anymore. The second clue was the kitchen drawer, the one I always used for the bills, the batteries, the spare keys, and the coupons my mother collected but never used. It was empty now, completely hollowed out, not even a single crumpled receipt to suggest that anyone had ever lived there. My father, the ever-practical man with his tidy button-downs and complete inability to sit in discomfort for more than 30 seconds. Probably checked the garage first, maybe assuming I'd just moved a few things to storage. But the storage unit was cleared, the garage was empty, and even the scuff marks on the concrete where my boxes once sat had been scrubbed away. It wasn't just that I'd left, it was the way I'd left. Like I'd erased myself from a crime scene no one was supposed to notice had ever occurred. Later, when the silence stretched long enough to be unsettling, Mom finally called. I didn't answer, not because I wanted to be cruel, but because I'd spent too many years responding to guilt dressed as love, too many nights listening to soft apologies that never came with action, too many birthdays where something came up, but somehow always came up for me, never Greg. Her voicemail was chirpy at first. Hey, sweetheart, just got home. House looks, well, kinda different. Did you do some cleaning or something? But as it trailed on, the nervous energy seeped through, that wavering tone that always came out when she realized something wasn't going according to her script. I listened to the whole thing once, then deleted it. Not saved for later, not kept as evidence, just gone, because I wasn't interested in explanations, not anymore. She sent another message later that night. This time it was shorter. We just want to talk. 7 words that probably felt heavy in her fingers as she typed them, but for me felt light enough to ignore. Talking was what we'd always done when they felt the need to reset the narrative, not when they were ready to own their part in the story. And I had no intention of stepping back into a house where my voice was always 2 volumes quieter than Greg's, where my needs were always postponed, where my pain was always digested in silence because expressing it would have disrupted the fragile balance of their golden child illusion. That night, as they sat on the couch they probably didn't realize was missing until one of them reached for the throw pillow I took with me, they would have begun to understand, not fully, not yet. But something would have started to sink in. Not the details, not the logistics of how I pulled it off so quietly, but the larger truth, the uncomfortable one. I hadn't gone off in a storm. I hadn't left in rage. I had left in stillness. And that stillness, that's what terrified people like them the most. Because you can argue with anger, you can plead with outrage, but silence doesn't give you anything to hold on to. Meanwhile, I was sitting 200 miles away, in a rental cabin with creaky floors and no cell signal unless I stood on the porch in my socks and leaned toward the east, watching the trees shift in the wind like they were trying to tell me something I already knew deep down. Maybe that leaving doesn't always come with a grand moment of victory, but sometimes with the soft, aching hum of self-respect settling into your bones. I made tea, I read a book, I pulled a blanket around my shoulders and didn't check my phone once, not because I was trying to make a point, but because there was nothing left on that phone that felt worth revisiting. They would call again, I knew they would. They would message, maybe even drive by my old place hoping to catch a glimpse of the daughter they had misplaced somewhere between Greg's 3rd DUI and my 30th unacknowledged birthday. But they wouldn't find me, not because I was hiding, but because I was finally fully gone in a way they could not undo. The kind of gone that doesn't slam the door, it just stops answering the bell. And maybe, just maybe, that's what they deserved. Not revenge, not retribution, just the vast, aching realization that the daughter they never really saw had walked out so quietly they didn't even notice she'd packed up her whole soul and taken it with her. Holidays have a way of pulling every unresolved feeling to the surface, like dust rising in sunlight, especially in families like mine. Families who smile for photos, set the good china, and sweep pain under expensive rugs until the cracks grow too wide to ignore. And by the time Thanksgiving rolled around, the absence I left behind had spread through my parents' house like an open window in winter, cold and creeping, subtle at first, but undeniable as soon as it touched the skin. The dining table, which had once been the sacred stage for my mother's forced performances of warmth, was dressed with the same embroidered tablecloth she had bought decades ago from a boutique in Vermont. The same worn napkin rings, the same predictable spread of mashed potatoes, green bean casserole, and overly crisp turkey. Yet one seat remained conspicuously empty, not by accident, not because someone forgot to set it, but because the presence that had always filled that space with quiet, unnoticed stability was no longer participating in the ritual of pretending everything was fine. My mother lit the candles. My father poured the wine. Greg arrived late, of course, making some comment about traffic and how impossible it is to find decent coffee near the highway. And when he dropped his keys on the counter with that practiced ease that came from a lifetime of being forgiven before he even asked, no one said a word. There was a strange stillness in the room, the kind that grows in the absence of someone whose role was never celebrated, but always expected. And as the first course was passed around without so much as a mention of my name, the unease began to thicken like the gravy congealing in the dish. Beside the turkey. Eventually, Greg, with his usual self-importance disguised as concern, broke the silence, leaning back in his chair and asking the question that should have come months earlier, but now hung in the air like smoke. "So has anyone heard from Jess?" The silence that followed wasn't the polite kind that waits its turn to speak. It was the sharp, strained kind that exposes the gaps between what's said and what's truly felt. My mother, carefully folding her napkin in her lap, as if the ritual of table manners might rescue her from accountability, offered a soft, "She's just going through something," followed by a deflective sip of wine. My father, never one to initiate conflict, unless it involved a broken thermostat or a bad cable signal, mumbled something about giving me space, but even he didn't believe his own excuse. And Greg, never one to sit with discomfort unless it was his own, looked from face to face before finally saying what no one wanted to admit. "Okay, but seriously, what the hell did you guys do?" It was the first time, perhaps in our entire family history, that someone actually asked the question out loud. Not to poke, not to stir drama, but to genuinely confront the truth that had always been too inconvenient to address. Of course, no one had an answer, because the answer wasn't one singular event, not a fight or a betrayal they could point to and say, "It all changed here." The truth was more complicated, more insidious, a pattern of dismissals, a lifetime of misalignments and double standards, of birthdays forgotten, of support selectively distributed like rationed affection in a war they never acknowledged was happening. Meanwhile, I sat in a coffee shop in a small coastal town, hundreds of miles away, sipping something hot and overly sweet, while watching strangers laugh with the kind of sincerity that comes when no one is pretending to love anyone more than they actually do. I hadn't told anyone where I was, hadn't posted a single thing online, hadn't sent a single card or message or cryptic line of poetry that hinted at my emotional state. I didn't feel the need to explain anymore, because explanation requires an audience willing to listen, and I had spent too many years offering my voice to ears that only heard what they wanted. In the weeks following Thanksgiving, they tried again, a string of messages, all variations of concern dressed up as confusion, began trickling into the inbox of an email account I no longer checked. "We're worried about you. Just let us know you're okay. This isn't like you, Jess." But it was like me. It was exactly like me. The version of me they had curated in their heads, the quiet, compliant daughter who always made it easier for them to feel good about themselves. That version had died a long time ago. What they were seeing now, what they were desperately trying to reach through a fog of their own making, was the result of a woman finally reaching her threshold, finally choosing peace over proximity, dignity over duty, and the irony, the delicious, aching irony, is that my revenge required no rage, no confrontation, no dramatic takedown with screaming or slammed doors. My revenge was quiet, patient, and deeply effective. It was found in my absence, in the way the holidays no longer looked whole, in the empty replies to messages that once went ignored when I was the one sending them. They were left with questions that had no answers, and a daughter-shaped silence they couldn't fill with second chances. The truth is, I didn't hate them. I didn't even wish them harm. What I wanted was so much simpler, so painfully basic, that admitting it almost feels embarrassing. I wanted to matter. Not in comparison to Greg, not as a runner-up or a fallback or a responsible afterthought. I wanted to be seen, to be heard, to be loved without having to earn it every time. And when that didn't happen, when it became clear that it never would, I chose to walk away before I became a ghost in a house that never saw me as flesh and blood to begin with. Whether they ever fully understood what happened, whether Greg ever stopped to consider that maybe the golden child only shines because someone else was left in the shadows, whether my mother ever looked in the mirror and wondered who taught her to ration love like money, we may never know. Some stories don't end with redemption or reconciliation. Some stories end with a woman packing 30 boxes, leaving one final note, and choosing herself for the first time in her life. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do isn't to scream, fight, or demand. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is disappear without a trace, leaving behind nothing but the unmistakable weight of what you no longer carry. And in that emptiness, they'll finally feel what you felt all those years. Unseen, unheard, unchosen.